We're good. Do you want to just go ahead and project the numbers the whole time? Is there anything? Yes.
Right. I'm going
People at home
to
see that.
call to order the March 3rd, 2025 meeting of the Board Finance Subcommittee. We are a subcommittee meeting, so we'll be using more of an open discussion process as we go along. I'm sure the more formal Robert. We're going to start with public comment on agenda and non-agenda items. Cards with any of our other members of the public that like to speak. I'll give you a whole 3 minutes. Seeing no public comment, we're going to go ahead and move on to the discussion. So, as a standing committee, we're subject to the Brown Act, which means that we will be noticing any items that we intend on speaking on for these meetings ahead of time, and they will be posted on the same place that the board agendas are. So for folks that want to follow the work of this committee, and I just want to say the intent of this committee is for folks who are familiar with Stephen Covey and his works around time management. There's the urgent and important quadrant. So we spend a lot of our time at the board meetings, and then there is what is called the not urgent but also important quadrant of work, which is foundational, forward-looking work that can actually help us better plan, better understand, and reduce the number of urgent things we have to deal with. And so I very much view this committee as functioning in that quadrant 2 place of not urgent, but also very important work. With that said, our first discussion item is the board finance process. And this is going to be the primary work plan for the committee from now through June. And so the purpose of the board finance process discussion is for us to discuss and understand the 4 parts of the financial processes of the district and actually put together a policy concerning how the board is going to be engaged in each of those processes, either from a fiduciary standpoint or from a forecasting and planning standpoint, what the role of the committee is in each of those processes, and then where are the places where we need to make sure we're giving the discretion and the ability to be nimble to staff. Some of those things may already be very clear and defined, some of them may not be, and that's the point of us reviewing them all over the next few months and discussing them and understanding them, with the intent to have proposed policies for recommending to the board at our June meeting for consideration by the board before summer. The first thing I want to bring up in this part of the discussion is I'm going to pass. You'll see the kind of planned week 1 topics in the agenda item. This is a printout of the initial topics, and
That's it. Okay. No,
can we get that one to Catherine?
Yeah.
So this is an initial brainstorming done entirely by me of the potential topics for us to discuss over our meetings between now and June for the 4 meeting plan. It was not intended to be comprehensive of the topics around finance that we want to make sure we're reviewing. And so I want to take time before we dig into the specific ones in today's agenda to brainstorm and see if there are additional items that we want to make sure, topics that we want to make sure that we consider during this review. And if there isn't anything on here today, we can add it as we go. But I wanted to start with just that review. And for folks that aren't fully able to see the whole plan, the topics that we are looking at reviewing from this initial list is today discussing reviewing the cycle with state financial projections. So reviewing the whole finance cycle as it's currently done. In budget contract review, which is how the board manages contracts and the execution of things that are within the approved budget, and out of budget adjustments, which are items that are not in the budget and coming for review. And so what are the current processes on that, as well as an initial discussion of what this committee's role is going to be, especially over the next few months, or putting out the broader element of it. The other topics that are listed are what are and how we manage and review restricted accounts, special education funds. Do we want to have a reserve policy? What should that policy be? What is our audit process? Is there anything about the audit process that we want to discuss? Internal controls, so more on a controller, clear fiduciary responsibility level, how we monitor state legislative changes, financial reporting, public communication, and then finally, what are all of our financial policies and how they work together. So that's the plan of the topics that I've initially kind of contemplated, and at this point, open up for discussion. And this can be from staff or committee, because this is a committee, we can be a little more informal.
Yeah,
So Lisa,
yeah, if I may.
please.
So I just want to understand a little bit about the intent and exactly kind of what we're looking at with, because I have some concerns when we talk about getting into the minutia of working with specific accounts day to day, because that would slow down operations and us getting things to school sites and things of that nature. So I guess I just want to understand a little bit more when we're looking at the, there was something in particular, like with the restricted accounts, reviewing, including the purpose funding expended, discuss how to best monitor and project funds for each account, restricted discussion. I'm just looking at I guess I'm wondering what is it that you're envisioning for that, because I want to make sure that it's productive for us to be transparent with the community and the board, make sure we're providing enough detail, but not to the point where it's findings work moving forward.
The reason for this work plan is specifically to discuss what our current procedures and policies are, and if there currently is or should be board involvement or if there shouldn't. So it's very much at the top level, and all of it's about either process and procedure for future forecasting and understanding what's on the horizon. I don't see anywhere where we would be intending to get involved in current day operations. Other than understanding if the process is being done correctly, what does that look like, so that we can properly know that's being.
Like I'd like to know, for example, like on the restricted funds, who on your team is looking over these? Like what we're voting on the vote is who's I don't know how it's set up in the team. I'd like to just overview. But that makes sense.
That's really helpful for knowing what it is that you guys are wanting us to bring forward, so that you can better understand and provide you with that level of detail. Because it'll depend on which restricted account. Some of them have, it's a small amount or, less restriction versus some are very complicated, and it's for everything that's spent. It goes from whoever initiates it at the school site up to, maybe technology is involved depending on type of purchase, to then it's typically through state and federal with somebody from there is looking at it to make sure that it's meeting the restricted. It also is checked with our budget tech to make sure that yes, funds are available and allocated. And through each of those pieces, it's okay. Is it appropriate? Or is there the funds available? So just, that's helpful for me to know, okay, here's maybe a workflow or something like that we could bring you to see that, okay, here are the possible scenarios. Is that kind of what you're looking for?
And also simply a description of each of the restricted funds you have. Is it reimbursement? Is it what? Just so we also understand the responsibilities that we have as a district for restricted funds. And I think for each of these items, there's going to be this element. So it is not the role of this committee to get into current day expenses, current day budget, or any individual expense. It's process, and it's also how we are able to see what's coming in the future, and how do we make our process something where we know ahead of time if there's we go through positive, there's going to be a surplus in
Right.
PMS, and what does that mean? Because it's a restricted.
Well, there
fund.
is. So yes, that's a great
Which is
example.
why I think that's an example. You know, and instead of, and how do we as the board, receive that information and understand what it means for opportunities? Because we also have the same responsibility we have for the general fund, we have to do restricted funds to make sure that they're being managed properly. And so we want to have a process that does that without creating some of the roadblocks, I think, that we've seen around having discussions around individual expenses that are really not necessarily in our purview. Or maybe in our purview, depending on how we decide to take that process. But I've seen places where having this conversation intentionally, and without any specific program or expense actually being the topic of it will be beneficial. So it's really something to do, what is our finance process as a board? And then along those lines, how can we use a committee that is now open to the public, we're able to have more detailed conversations on finance to make sure that the public is properly managed. And there's one other thing I think that the trigger funds are particularly, if you great, since we don't have a grant writing team, as board, I would love to know what grants we're applying for down the road, what's coming down the horizon, and what we've been awarded. Like where we are in the process, it's just, an update, like I said, quarterly or whatever, just kind of like, I know they have specific deadlines and stuff, so that would be.
Yeah.
That's a perfect brainstorm of what I'm actually asking for
Yeah.
at this list. So.
And that actually aligns with the work that we're doing in that there hasn't been a process when people are going to apply for grants. And so it's been, again, it was on our urgent, not important as in, or important, not urgent, because of timing with everything else going on, but that's been a process sitting there in draft form for 2 years. That we have almost ready to move forward.
Yeah, we're on this wonderful brainstorming point, which actually gets back to the question I had. Do you have any more of those things that we could add that we should be contemplating on this list for our?
I think that what would be helpful is that if I come back with here's our, and that's maybe part of, I don't know, I defer to Daisy on that with our strategic planning. I want to, because I don't want to, right.
Well, and one thing, let me use that as a question more to our committee, and recognize that actually we did share all of this, but there's been a few things happening over the last week. So we had a meeting to plan, and then we weren't able to talk since. So Roxanne and Margaret, there are other things that we'd want to make sure we see on this list for our work plan before we dive into the rest of the stuff about it.
I would just say not only state legislative monitoring, I would say federal also, just because an example would be a letter of February 14th that came out that we may pull funds. I know I brought up, you said 4%, 50% of our funds.
It's about 3%, and even in that letter, they state that they really have no legal basis to say to do any of what they threaten to do.
Yeah, I would.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I would just add that in as potential, just with
It's always important.
And then around here.
I'm here more to be a person who understands nothing about money, to give you the feedback of if I don't understand, then our public probably still don't understand.
So, very helpful.
You have things that you don't understand make common sense.
No. I like what you said about just making our processes more transparent for people. I think people would like to know how it's being decided, what money is being spent and where.
And then I had one other, which is our actions this last week, like more surveillances. How we manage our finances with our administration. So, and those are all things that will be agendized for future discussions, so maybe we're gonna actually dig in and start talking about things.
As, and actually, with that was, the special ed funds. Just building on the presentation I got for
Yeah.
maybe about implementing some of the recommendations that we. I know it's discussion item, but
There's two components to that. One is how we kind of specialize in our board process and procedures. And the other is actually having separate discussion from this for finance process work. Getting an update, when update is ready. We definitely see that with things on the topic of there were some multi-year.
there's a lot of, there's a lot of stuff. So,
Yes.
Let's make sure we add that to the future one. So running else on it, the items that I wanted to talk about first, because I felt like they were the ones that we're most ready for without a lot of preparation for this first meeting, is what the budget review cycle is, which will obviously impact all of this conversation. And then in budget and out of budget adjustments, and contract approvals, and that's just from some recent conversations I thought we were going to have as a discussion as we're moving forward. But we said we could start by just outlining our budget process, and if we need to, I actually have the CSBA on calendar.
Well, and I can, sorry,
All right, I'm getting a little, they need a little bit louder voices and a little bit more clear enunciation is what I've heard online.
And we're supposed to be in Zoom.
You don't have to. This is the owl. This is, to talk to the owl.
loud.
Loudly.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so, we have, and I can pull up our website, actually, where I'll go ahead and yep. Our website and look at business services and look over here at fiscal. There's a lot of stuff which is great for you guys to know also, but also for the public, that in our on our webpage we have information on all of our budget reporting for the last several years. And here is our cycle right there.
It's on the fiscal service.
Yep, if you go to fiscal services and then budget. And there are links to the last 4 years of our financial reports. So if you expand those, it has what we've done so far, although it actually looks like we need to have our first interim added here. It's not linked. And then 23-24, you'll see our full. If anybody wants to go back and read years worth of super fun and exciting. But the important thing is that it is a cyclical process. It's, remember, it is driven by the LCAP. So budget development, we can't actually, even by law, we have to have our hearing for our LCAP prior to having our hearing for our budget, and then same thing with adoption. So in June, we're required to have 2 separate meetings. One was the hearing of the LCAP and then the hearing for the budget, and then one for the adoption of the LCAP and then the adoption of the budget. They legally have to take place on different dates in June. So just as a caveat there, our fiscal year, just as a reminder, is July 1 through June 30. And the only time that our numbers are final and real is the following fall for the prior year. So let's maybe start with that in September, that's when we, by September 15th, we're required to submit to SCO our unaudited actual. So it's where we say that we finished for the year prior, they're called unaudited because it hasn't gone through the actual audit process. That doesn't happen until later in the year. And then there could always be slight adjustments based on that. So that's when we have final numbers and actual real, there aren't any projections done at that time. It's only backwards looking.
So that's when we found out if we overspent.
Yes. Yeah, that's where we find out, okay, and again, a budget is a plan. So it's always, here's what we expect to happen, and then you make adjustments throughout the year, just like you did with the personal accounts. Okay, this month I didn't work as many hours as, I had expected, so my paycheck's a little bit less. Most of us are on salary, but that's, just thinking of how to equate that. And our reserve is like our savings account. And so that's where it's important not to be spending our reserve, because you wouldn't want to be paying your mortgage or your car payment out of your savings. Make sure that you have those ongoing funds available. So, so I'll kind of start with, since we started with unaudited, in December, that is reflective of it's our first check-in for the year. So it's, okay, what have we spent? And what are we doing with revenues between July 1 and October 31st? That's due as a report to the board and then SCO by December 15th. And so it's, okay, for that first quarter, are we tracking? We've made all the changes in the budget that were, actually different than what happened, than what we adopted versus what the state actually enacted, all of that stuff. So December is our first check-in. We give what is our actual activity, July 1 through October 31st, plus a projection of where we think we're going to finish the current year, plus 2 more years. So that extra 2 years is our multi-year projection. And all of these are based on, they're never going to be exactly right. They're always going to be exactly wrong, and most of it. Or right, based on the information in the capital plan. Because the information will always be changing. It's, what differences were there in hiring? What differences were there in the actual state enacted budget? Where did our enrollment actually come in? So is that going to affect whether we're funded on the current year, prior year, or average of 3? All of those things adjust.
Ask me a quick question.
Please.
So, previously, when you're projecting that during this time, and you're saying, okay, we think our enrollment's going to go up. Was this where there was like a high, medium, and low? And we have been using
medium,
and
it came in at low.
We're gonna, based on the downward trend, we're going to use low for most of our going forward until something changes.
Right, and we expect based on potential the board policy that the board adopted the other day with changes in charter and the way that those are authorized, we can make some assumptions that will probably be a little bit different in second interim based on out years, not for next year. So
when we're projecting low, would it be more coming on us to project prior years, since we actually know for certain what that would be?
So what we do, because the LCFF calculator, which is what we use to project our revenues, it takes that into account. So we project low, and then what it does is it'll pull the highest funding, whether it's current, prior, or the average of 20. So, and then that
year will be at.
So they can actually make adjustments up until February for the prior. So not necessarily.
No. But probably without as much swing.
Yes. Yes, but that's not always indicative. So if we had done that this last year, but then we were already projecting lower enrollment, and so it came in even lower than that. So that's not. Yes, our funding will be always current, prior, or the average of 3, which it's whatever the highest is and what we will actually be funded on. So, okay, sure.
You said differences in hiring. So would that be like we hire someone and they're on a different, like maybe we hire someone with 10 years of experience. So, okay, so,
Right, because we make projections based on, say, okay, the mid-range salary projections, and then somebody comes in, they're brand new, that would be a savings recognized, or somebody comes in with 20 years of service, that's gonna be substantially more. Also, we may have, like what we did this year, is that we had, with that lower enrollment, we had positions that were vacant, at a school, we didn't fill those necessarily, we split staffing. In prior years, we would have filled that position, and that would have been an increase in the budget. So things like that all impacted, or, think about last year when we had a lot of safety type positions, we had restoratives and SSA, campus supervisors, all of those that were unfilled for a long period of time. That's where we may or may not make adjustments. So it's okay, we still expect to fill them, or we're going to close them. Those are all the decisions that have to be made and updated with each of those according.
is the cost of a potential hire, like their experience or education, is that considered at all in the hiring process?
Anybody to move point as policy or?
Practice about this.
I think that's pretty standard cost.
So typically our audit would come to the board in January. I will say that not only for us, but for many districts since COVID, there has been a lack of timeliness in completion of audit reports, not just from the district perspective, but also from audit firm perspectives. They've had a hard time staffing and catching up with all of the one-time funds and different events that have happened, such as wildfires and, all of these lovely things that impact their ability to work with districts. In fact, many audit firms have dropped clients because of workload. So we have not had that happen as far as dropping of us, but we've had, a delay from the auditors in a couple of years. And this year we have a delay because we had a transition in staffing. So, we have things that, and whenever there's a delay in that audit report, we have to make a request to the county office. If they concur with our request, then that goes to actually the state just for them to say, yes, that's fine, for that as well. And typically those are approved. So,
Will that audit inclusive of restricted funds and upcoming audits? Or?
yeah. All of them, the only thing that we have to do as a separate audit are our bond funds. So we actually do a separate audit for bonds. And then for specific project reimbursements from the state, when we get those state matching funds, they audit particular projects. So it's another
layer.
So, but typically we have, actually for us, we have several audits because they have to be noted with the same for sure. So we typically have our school budget audits, which includes all of our funds except for bond. So it's going to include CNS, all of our restricted and our our developer groups, all of that stuff. And then the bond is separate. And that's
a new person, do we hire the auditing firm or is it assigned to us?
we hire, and so we've used Siobhan and Associates has been with the district, I'm not sure how many years. There's a requirement that they have to change the lead auditor every couple of years. So you don't just have the same person over and over, so you get a different perspective, and so and we have to by April notify the county office who we've selected for our audit firm. With auditors, you aren't required to do an RFP. You can. Typically when, it is when you do have the same auditor that you use regularly, they're familiar with your systems, they know where maybe your trouble spots have been, those things that they're going to look a little bit, they're going to have a little more detail. Versus it can also be good to have a fresh set of eyes come in. So I know that,
And changing having someone different every couple of years as required by law. Yeah, it's required by law. It's good because you get that different, different focus on different areas. And I think the district's been happy with their current auditors, so on top of it. But it did happen a lot during, transition from COVID back into in-person. Many districts were dropped because they couldn't go for the work with. They lost a lot of people. They weren't, we weren't the only ones to lose students and families to other states. It happened in the industry of accounting as well. Because we were one of those districts previously that were dropped and had to find another one. Yes.
We'll kind of learn more in depth in the audit process in future
Yeah.
meetings, so.
yeah, I'll get to
For
the
the
next,
government, for
yeah.
the governance process and the next after we can describe them and everything's there.
yeah, so the interim reports are the check-in ones essentially, and if you have a qualified status in first and second interim, then you have to do a third interim, so it's an extra check-in. The governor puts out his budget proposal, so initial proposal in January, and that's for the following year. So when we're doing our multi-year projections in December, we're basing it off of what was actually adopted 6 months earlier. And then in January, it's based on what they think it's going to be 6 months in the future. And so that's kind of the guidance every time that we develop a budget for the interim reports or multi-year projections. We are supposed to be using the governor's proposal. Or the same thing in May, it's a revised proposal based on the additional information that comes in and the indicators for what the statutory cost of living adjustment is. So that's set out by law, and then they can adjust it from there. They can choose to fund it or not. And then in June is when those LCAP and budget hearings happen. So in this whole time frame, we're sharing information about LCAP and budget, and then we're soliciting input on LCAP and budget. So it's kind of this ongoing.
How is the trail going to those people coming after the budget approval for some of these items?
So that is in August. So we are required to do what's called a 45-day update. It doesn't mean that we have to go in and update every account in Escape and then present a full fiscal report. It means that we have to report to the board and the public how the changes, the differences between what we projected and what was actually adopted. Usually that's where the trailer bill comes in. Sometimes that happens later even. Those are incorporated in first interim. But we typically will be providing, again, those reports in August, or as we do, sometimes when we do an unaudited report, even though we don't do a multi-year projection, we'll report on if there's are significant changes expected. We'll give a heads up about that. And then we usually do a presentation around the January budget proposal and the May revise that's separate and kind of as a preview or precursor to actually developing the budget.
It's a good basis. It's a cycle that we're not in covering our process into, so understanding the proper point where we actually go to talk about something and understand something. Yeah. Because I do feel that. So, this will be the primary part of our work over the next few months. The two items that we put up for discussion today is around the contract review, which is a big chunk of our consent calendar. In conjunction with the fact that as a board we approved the budget in which any of those contracts will fall into, and because it's a discussion, one of the reasons that I want to start with this one's been it's more values based for the board as to where we are providing our guidance and oversight versus getting into the weeds of day-to-day administration. And obviously, for the 4 months developing these policies, but that's an easy place for us to start talking about where we do our highest and best value. And some of the conversations we've had recently with consent calendar items around
things that are in budget and execution of the plan that's been previously approved. Causing me to think of this one as one that we probably have top of mind when we talk about. Reason is, if you want to add context before, we had actually previewed this conversation, so.
So actually what might be helpful is talking about, kind of the way that the budget report looks in Escape. So there are different management codes. So for example, superintendent's budget really encompasses everything, a lot of the board actions and activities, the superintendent's activities and costs, and then things under that position. So like the communications, right now that's included in there versus that's something that we could look at pulling out, in creating its own management code. Right now it's encompassed in there. And so, for example, say there's, and these are not real numbers, but say there's $100,000 budgeted for the superintendent for the year. That's for all of those activities, and it's split up into different categories like staffing, supplies, travel and conference, contracts, all of those things. So all of those different categories are included in that lump sum overall $100,000. As things are, so say we had staffing of 50,000, that then is going to be, that's encumbered. So that means it's not available for spending on other things because it's committed. And then say that leaves $50,000 available for other activities within that superintendent's budget. So for example, a contract for, something communications or whatever, that would be, say, for $5,000 or $10,000, that then would come to the board for asking for that on consent. That means that it fits within that budget, and it's
been budgeted for.
Yeah, it's budgeted for. It's not that particular contract. It's that this was the plan in the year that the budget had the budget for the superintendent's activities had this much money in it, and that will mean that there's something else within that category, that superintendent's budget, that doesn't get spent on that because it's now, once the board approves it, is encumbered here, and that then reduces that by that next $10,000, and there's 40,000 remaining to be used for whatever those other categories are. And so there's one large bucket, and then things can be moved within that bucket, and that's for each department or category. So you look like you have a question, Roxanne.
When something is under consent, are those always usually sometimes things that have already been paid?
Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. So usually they are not. Sometimes they are, in that it was not always the practice of the district to put all contracts on a consent agenda. And so there are things that, schools spend their budgeted funds on particular things that they want to do. And so the timing of things sometimes will not align. And so there are things that have been going on for years that maybe were brought forward in the past. And now we're trying to make sure that everything is actually on there, as our board policy currently states, and Ed code is that everything has to be approved by the board, basically ratified. Otherwise, it's not technically a legal contract.
To clarify, for a vendor to enforce the contract on us, it needs to be ratified.
Correct.
They're not going to be ratified for us to make an expenditure.
Correct. Exactly.
And the reason for this to be on here is that there may be a certain dollar threshold in which if it is something that's budgeted and planned for, we may want to provide the discretion unless the vendor is requesting our approval for them to be able to enforce it. We would be okay with it not having to come to us for ratification because we're not required to do that.
Right.
Unless it changes the budget, or the vendor wants, I think that's 15,000.
That's typical, is 15,000. That's And usually it's the superintendent or designee, so it's typically the superintendent.
And here for us, it's either her and I, that's it. There's nobody else that can sign.
And what that does is there are two things, and I actually used to have an attorney who would say, I would be fine if you didn't take any contracts to the board, because then you're not bound by anything, which is not the way to operate.
Right.
That's just for context.
That's the other extreme.
Exactly. That's exactly it. There are things that are of an urgent nature or just general operating that can hinder actual, there are things that come up that, oh, you know what, there's this field trip that all of a sudden these kids they qualify to go for a competition.
Mhm.
And the timing of it
Yeah,
does
this is very
not
short.
match our board timeline and agenda. So those are often things that we're pre-signing.
Mhm.
Typically it's me. I'm saying yes, okay, because there's funds available there, it falls within the guidelines, all of those things. And so,
But within the context of our policy right now, that is risky.
yes, absolutely.
And so the reason for this discussion is, as we're framing this proposed process, do we want to, and should we open a little bit more latitude on pre-budgeted small items for flexibility, so we're not putting. And honestly, sometimes we're having conversations that think there's already spent, so everybody's vote yes, and putting a board in a position of saying you have to do something.
So a couple things, I think, as I look through some of them, I try to look through every one of them.
And I appreciate that.
Likewise.
Sometimes a little
Yes.
too far.
Sometimes not just for you.
No,
It probably is.
no,
But, so is we've gone like 15,000,
Mhm.
is that typical for our side of the, for our district's side of the budget?
So to give
Usually
to give you a
bigger,
little perspective, I had a much smaller budget and my top was 15,000. Yeah. So I think for bigger districts, it tends to be higher. Because again, we were small. I think my whole budget was, 16 million. And my threshold was 15,000. So
yeah, my prior was a $30 million budget and our limit was 15,000.
that's 50,000 more. The other thing was, who writes the little synopsis of each item?
So the department that it's coming from is supposed to be writing that, and what happens often is that it's a follow-up from my team saying, hey, we need more detail here.
Because I would say what would be helpful for me is,
Mhm. Okay.
particularly on the fiscal impact, like where
Okay.
where it's coming from, is it restricted? Is it unrestricted?
And-
Is it the one-time grant that's got us on some truck? I don't know if that is.
So
one of the categories.
so the category, there is a funding source on there, and usually it'll say site LCAP, or it'll say special education or things of that nature. As far as what has gotten us in trouble with the one time has not necessarily been on those contracts. It would be ongoing costs like personnel. Those are the things, those one-time contracts or those one extra supports. That is where we should be spending one-time costs versus on staffing, unless it's specifically, notated that when we hire a position, when this funding goes away, this position specifically goes away.
So just for, again, with all transparency,
Yeah.
it helps me know whether I should look at this closely or, hope I get it. Move on to the next thing. Does that make sense?
It
Yeah, I
does.
think in general, most of them have been pretty good about putting that in, but a lot of times it's.
It might not be very clear.
Yeah.
Okay. It's
Of course, people-
I'm looking at some of the ones that we just approved and I can see where it's like, it's donations, it's vendors. And it says funding source on on like the ones coming from fiscal, but not always on the other ones. So, okay.
Just, that'll be some of
Total
them.
so for example, total of the contract was that, but it didn't say where it was coming from. Oh, we can make those changes. Yeah,
Absolutely.
All right, real quick, so,
Yeah.
so for going contracts, the
Yeah.
one that I pulled the other one.
Yes.
We'll just still keep track, and so
Yeah,
it's at the
that-
policy level.
Oh, I think we're not about contract.
We vote on it in our next meeting, so.
Okay, yeah.
They're asking for us to continue to
Oh,
project our voices a little bit louder.
Might get my
I'm bad about that.
Yeah, no, no, deal.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll delay that.
if if it's a procedural question, then absolutely, Jermaine, but if it's on the topic, then that's.
Okay.
Okay. And I did just write down on our list, use of one-time funds, which is already intended to be a future discussion on the reserve policy, but add that to this, as we're going through this. Awesome. Yeah. Questions or thoughts on? I mean, so where I've been heading with this is how the board handles in contract or in budget contracts being something that needs to be different from out of budget contracts, but also out of budget adjustments. So as I kind of mentioning earlier, the headline in September when the unaudited actuals come in, how do we make sure that that's not the first time we're hearing about those things?
So,
And when I say we, I don't necessarily mean the board, I mean the broader community. And
so I actually would like to clarify on that because in unaudited, we were actually less than 1% off in projections. It was tenths of 1%. And so that's amazing.
Unheard of.
That's amazing. So,
you can say that louder, I guess.
Yes,
I want to get it on the recording.
Yeah,
I think you did,
you
yeah.
did, yes.
Amazing, phenomenal.
Okay.
So what that means is that as we're going through and doing the adjustments and specifically in June, saying, okay, here's where we think we're going to finish this year, even though we're not finished operating. And then in September, when it comes back, here's what, yes, we were right on our estimations of that. It's in first interim. And I think that, so yes, that is really important. Absolutely. And I think that what we need to do a better job at is helping determine we need to do a better job of explaining what carryover is and how that works, because that was the majority of the adjustment between budget and first interim. And, with expenditures and revenues in some of those categories has to do with the way that we have to budget and recognize revenues and expenditures in those restricted funds. So we have to budget and plan as if we're going to spend them all out. And then that's going to be zero. So then when we start the new year, we have to put it all back in. And so it really doesn't help with messaging to say, oh yeah, we're off by this much. Really, we aren't off by 13 million. We were off by the difference in the cost for non-public agency placements is, if you really wanted to look at dollar for dollar, that's where the bulk of it was because of master agreement cost increases. So that was something that I will be quite honest, it hit us by surprise with that. And so that's one of the things that we're working on is, and it ties into the next topic. So maybe I go too far into detail there, but that's absolutely, those are adjustments that we need to be messaging far and wide, providing more detail. I don't know whether that would be, even when we don't have reporting coming forward, if that's something that the board wants is just a little update. I don't know. So that's, obviously, with this finance subcommittee, that this is where we would hear that.
Yes. And so the question on timing is the topic is the next one. How soon or how much time prior to the first interim report do we have the information on this?
I have to say probably a week or two, because it's that last week is the week before first interim is when our team is just hustling to get it done because we could do stuff earlier and then it wouldn't be as complete and accurate. So it's kind of a chicken and the egg kind of a thing there. As far as,
That's the only type of example when you're looking at the budget.
no, it's not. I mean, there are always, again, like I said, with hiring, so that's where you're gonna have that, where you have a difference there, whether it's under or over. There'll be, maybe a shift in something that comes up that, hey, there's this emergent need that we need to address something, and so that would come to you as a, contract that, hey, this isn't budgeted for. This is something that's something I'm trying to think of one in particular. But I mean, there's probably a million examples of when that could happen. But we try not to make that, we try to make sure that that doesn't happen, but, it's all.
My intent for the process for February is to say, it seems very important for us to have conversations at this committee and the board,
Mhm.
on the out of budget.
Mhm.
And it seems like we're currently more able to trade conversations about things that in budget, like essentially, and how do we change the ability of the board to focus on, not focus on necessarily as much on the things that we already said we want to do, but focus more on the things that change the circumstances in which we make those decisions.
Mhm.
Um, that's my thought process, and
So I know, back to your original questions, like, as far as setting for guidance on what we use, like, type of dollar. My suggestion, I like the 15,000, I would say, in my mind, I'm thinking 15,000 for, restricted funds, and maybe 10,000 for unrestricted. Just for, or in the fiduciary responsibility, same rate bonds, so 15 for both.
I think getting thresholds good, so for about, we want to, we're comfortable with and recognizing that we're about to have a bunch of conversations in this recommendation to go forward until June. So, yeah,
I just want to make it clear that what we were planning.
we'll put that in, and then when it comes back in June, it's just about a dollar amount as we've gone through the process, but I think saying that we are interested in budget contract review threshold to propose. And it sounds like we're interested in, we need to think more about how we would have earlier indicators around out of budget. That's a good, outcome to this step of, this process. Summarizing this item to everyone who else was, basically saying we are interested in the committee and looking at a policy and the fruition on this that would set a threshold for what has to come to the board. Somewhere between 10 and 15,000 if it's in budget. But we're also interested in looking at mechanisms to make sure we're getting earlier indications around anything that would be out of budget.
Yeah, and I will say that that's, something that we've been working really hard on this year is more collaboration and clear communication between, special services, fiscal, educational services, those things. In fact, we participated in the fiscal finance subcommittee meeting and the fiscal subcommittee, as well as the rate setting. And those are things that will tie into our ability to know when we have big changes like that coming from, like that we have that level of.
Years of work on that one.
So are we looking, from what you just said, are we looking to put more trust in staff on smaller items, not have all the smaller items have to come to us, but looking for more transparency on larger?
Enable us to focus more on the big picture. And things when we change the overall. Earlier that there might be some surprise and maybe make further adjustments.
And then this, I think not just an item, but if we know we're gonna get hit with something coming from, reducing revenue in SOFA, it has the same effect on our budget in terms of it increases our expenses, that's also an item that we need to try to catch up over.
One comment here, so I want to talk about the master contract and how,
No, not quite yet.
Very next item.
Next one, yeah.
Let me finish this.
Okay.
Okay,
understood.
Yeah.
Okay,
So I'm actually gonna wrap this item up. I mean, I think these could have had it easy for us to have some guidance, so, any further thoughts for me for next time? We don't have public comment throughout this, but, Catherine, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share with us? I'm gonna pause between the items.
On this,
Thank you. So we'll go ahead and move to the second item on our agenda, which is, supplement multi-year forecast and options, Lisa, I'll just.
And actually, I asked, John and I kind of met and talked a little bit before coming in also, as we know, SELPA or special education is, it's a large chunk of our budget and is made up of several funding sources. So it's state, federal, and then everything else is anything that's not covered by those two pots comes from our general fund or unrestricted general fund as a contribution. Or it's part of services provided under the general fund, because I want to, I say it all the time, and I think that it's really important as we start the conversation that our special education students are general education students first. And so that means that we would be spending, and so our contribution is what it should be, if you were to really break it down by dollars, would be, okay, what are we spending on every child in general education? And that should be our contribution. That's not necessarily the way it works because the federal government has never met their level of commitment for special education funding. So essentially, that's really where that breakdown is, and it's not sufficient on the state side either. So what we provide is the general education level, the state and federal funds, and then we also have a larger contribution. So that's kind of the way that works. So, for example, and we've been talking about this, that during the unaudited actual process, there were items we said, okay, you know what, these are programs that are not directly servicing students in special education, or these are things that we would be providing to all general education students. So let's move those into our general fund, unrestricted general fund for accounting, and then account for special education as all of the extra services only. And that's how we are working towards getting our maintenance of effort under control, is by really trying to be very strategic about what we actually include in special education costs versus general education costs. So just as a precursor on that piece of it. I know throughout the year we talked several times that the SELPA they brought in school services to facilitate the fiscal subcommittee meeting for SELPA. And we had some really great conversations in there about how our funding model for the SELPA, which is special education local plan area for non-edu speak, which it's essentially most of the districts in Sonoma County, and we're required to be part of a SELPA, whether it's our own or a member of another one. And it's to make sure that as kind of a region, we kind of pool our resources together to make sure that students are being supported in special education. John, this is your wheelhouse, so if I misspeak or don't cover something, please.
I worked to stop with the fingers, just hard to stop.
So essentially the state and federal local money or special education money comes into the SELPA, which is housed at SCO. And they distribute it out to all of the member districts. And so the method at which they distribute that is a locally determined thing. And here it's been the same for the last 20 some odd years. And it essentially does not align with the way that the funds are received by the SELPA. So funds come into the SELPA based on ADA, not special education ADA or by disability or any of that aside from, it's by overall ADA. And then it's been distributed in our local SELPA structure based on severity, which actually incentivizes maybe what's identified as the primary disability by districts when, conducting an IEP and the way that they report. And that is not always the case. It may just be that certain districts have a higher number, a higher percentage of higher needs students. There are all kinds of factors that lead to that. But essentially, Santa Rosa City Schools has benefited from that structure for a number of years. And the will of the SELPA, the Superintendent's Council, because just like you have a board, the SELPA is governed by the group of superintendents who are of the member districts. And so through this committee, we made the recommendation, we concurred that the SELPA distribution should more closely align with the way that the funds come in. And there were 3 scenarios presented to the Superintendent's Council. And thank you to Daisy for us being able to phase in to the new funding model, because many districts wanted to kind of, as they said, move to full implementation in the first year, which would have had it already has a substantial impact on a reduction in revenues for us. It would have been, I don't know how we would have, weathered that with all of our other issues that we're trying to right size. And the thing is,
It was insane.
I know the answer, that's why I want to.
Yes, so, there was a motion made to, go with the first year, so rip off the Band-Aid, that's what they were calling that model. And, they didn't do a roll call vote, they just kind of nays and yays. And so it appeared that that's what we were gonna go with, that that's what won. And then, thank you, when we did a roll call vote, because we were counting, it didn't seem right.
we're going, it's not right, it's not right, it's not right.
Yeah. So we did a roll call, and it was even. It was everyone split. So I moved to make a motion to go with the second model. And one of the members on there didn't care either way. So we ended up winning by 1.
And that number was.
What was it, 7?
It was a chart, the chart.
The chart on this one, that it didn't impact them.
Yeah.
So I think it was, 7.
Yeah, it wasn't a large,
6
it
or
was
7.
small impact to them.
Yeah, there were 7 yes and 6 no's. Because at one point we were 7-7 or 6. Yeah, 7-7. It was 7-8.
Yeah.
So yeah, there was 7-7,
6, 8.
and then it was
And
6.
6-8 is one
Yeah,
split.
exactly.
And, yeah.
Wait, I'm trying to make this make sense in my head. So the current model, it sounds like, is more equitable based on need?
It's not more equitable. It's basically it favors people, districts who have higher needs students.
Kind
Kind of,
like
you can
real
explain.
quick. So it's based on, in our computerized system on the IP, what is listed as primary disability. And if it is one of autism, intellectual disability, emotional disability, orthopedic impairment, etc., SELPA was funding most recently at about $23,000 per student. And other students with identified IEPs were getting virtually 0. So they were So the money was being split up based on the number of students who fit into these so-called severe disability categories. And that's what was changing to base it on APA.
So it wasn't necessarily based on student need.
Yeah, exactly.
It was based on what was identified as the
Yeah.
primary.
But the example would be if there were a high functioning student who was identified as autism, it was in general ed, et cetera, you would still accrue the $22,000, which is, I think, why it was determined to be in the course.
Yeah.
Just as a general, just for one, how did it impact us on a percent base? Did we lose 20?
So I will actually pull up I will pull up the scenario for you so you can see what that looks like. And there were three options presented. One was immediate full implementation next year. One was a 2-year implementation, and the last was a 3-year implementation. And
We knew the 3-year implementation was not gonna make the vote.
no, yeah, it really was not. So if we go here to expect right here. So we are area 4 because our SELPA is broken up into different areas. And for us, our current funding, so this was off of 23-24, not current, not actual current. So in 23-24, we see here, trying to see which one is which. Okay, so actual. So for 23-24, we received about 15 million, but sorry, wrong one. About 19 million between the elementary and the high school district. And then under the, as a comparison, under the ADA distribution, this is a 50%. It would have been 11.8 and 5.2. So our total right here, so here's the reduction for the high school. It's negative 1.35. So reduction, and for the elementary, it's a reduction of about 376,000. Yeah, it's roughly 1.8 in this in the first year, and then that would be double in the next year. So you will see that in the second interim report. Now that they've actually taken a vote, and because it was all over the place as far as what it could, and they could have decided not to make a change.
And those, how does this, do we have the community church program that's 100% funded from SELPA?
Off
How
the
do you-
top.
Off the
Yeah,
top.
so how does this impact?
This, so I'm gonna go back over here, and we're gonna, I think this is, no, this doesn't. I was thinking that showed it, but it doesn't, sorry. Stop sharing. So essentially the way it works is that the SELPA, all the money comes into the SELPA, and there are different categories. Some of it is called low incidence funding. So for, that would typically be deaf and hard. If you want to give some,
Additionally impaired, things of that nature.
so, you know, basically there's extra funding that comes into the SELPA, again, based on ADA for that. And over the years, there's been a surplus that has been accrued in that category. We at Santa Rosa City Schools provide the elementary regional program for deaf and hard of hearing. So that's taken, those costs are taken off the top before any of these other distributions are made. So that's why when we talk about it's definitely, you know, it's the DHH program, that's because really it's a direct funded from the SELPA off the top that doesn't impact. You know, we don't have a general fund contribution to that program. So it actually, when you think about in Dr. Gillespie's report, where he said that we have a lower contribution or a lower percentage of cost for special education, that's one of the reasons why. Is that overall we don't necessarily, but because of that particular program, it's essentially self-funded, if you want to call it that. So that's why that's a little bit different. Now we did some of the other things that happened this year is there were some one-time or some of those surplus funds that as a committee, we recommended and the superintendent's council agreed to distribute some of that to offset some increasing costs. So it wasn't all bad news for us. There were other areas where we actually saw a positive short-term revenue offset of that. Of some of those costs.
But we're having continuing costs with the SELPA because they want to spend down, I think it's in the lowest instance, $2 million, something of that nature, so.
I'm looking at the multi-year forecast, we're seeing, I mean, these numbers, 2.5 and 5 million. And we believe after the,
Right.
obviously the analysis now is 1.8 and 3.6 for which is that's in the right direction. What's the long-term consequences of this trend?
So it will depend on ADA across the board. So that's where, because it's no, all ADA. So as districts change in their ADA percentage, as far as for the county, so when you think, or for the SELPA, so for example, all of our schools, so including our charters, are considered schools of Santa Rosa City. So that would include Kid Street is considered one of our schools under SELPA. For Roseland, they have their charters are considered schools of their district, and so their ADA that they're funded on includes their charters.
But do we mean when we see a charter and that charter is covered outside?
Yeah, well, and there are different ways, so that would be written into the charter, how if they are joining as an individual member, or if they are considered a school under us, so there are different structures for that, so.
That's a part of the application.
Yeah, part of the petition. Mhm.
That's something for us to keep in mind as we move into next year.
Absolutely.
One of the discussions has been that there's not a necessity for this SELPA to necessarily review SELPA. And we hadn't really had more thoughts on the pros and cons of where the health and right now we have the same amount of votes as someone in one school district for students. And so from a governance equity standpoint, that's clearly not but the pool of funds is probably larger and the DHA program is being coming off the top. So that's the consideration is and contextualize if there was a moratorium that was in a little being lifted at the state until the new SELPAs. What are our thoughts on that now? Like, how are we seeing that? How do we actually know?
So I think that previously, so there was a study done a couple of years ago as far as would it make sense for us to become our own SELPA? And that was looked at from the revenue side only. It was not looked at from an expenditure side. And that was funded by SCO. It came back that under that revenue structure, we would lose money by becoming our own SELPA. Now that the funding structure has changed, I don't know that that would be true. And so I think that's something that could certainly be worth exploring. We don't necessarily on our own meet the threshold of the 15,000 students. So should we see a larger influx of students, should we see more students, or should there be another district or two who want to look at that with us, then that would be something that we could explore once that moratorium is lifted. If we decide that that is something we would want to explore, we have to provide 1 year notice to the SELPA.
So for 26, 27, the letter would have to go in before July 1st of this year to the SELPA, notifying in notification of intent to leave. But that just leaves open the option, as I understand it.
So really just to clarify, we could potentially join up with some of our feeder districts to form our own SELPA. They could makes sense.
if it makes sense. And with that, that's creating a new entity, so it would, just like as I shared, the Sonoma County SELPA it's housed at SCO, it's not run by SCO. It's a separate entity that operates there. So it would be the same thing if we were to do it. It would be a separate entity, and we'd have that same superintendent's council, have to come up with their own bylaws and all of that. But it is a separate entity that then has member districts. You can be a single district SELPA, but you have to be larger than we are.
Large.
Yeah.
We're very.
Yes, we are very close.
But if we going to have fewer districts, would it be the same issue of us only having one vote?
That would depend on the bylaws.
Certainly.
It could be done differently.
Just like from the set. Correct.
And they're not looking to change it, so some history. When Diane ongoing, it has now come to updating the plan next year. And the move is to remove that additional vote. So we've been getting 2 votes. I want to say for what, maybe 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
We are losing that second vote next year.
Right, they're changing to appropriate.
They're updating the plan and they're not going to include that as part of it. It needed to be agreed upon by the Region 4. The Region 4 superintendents, and because Petaluma and bigger districts don't get the same advantage of having an additional vote based upon the number of students that they have, they're removing that second vote because it was never part of the plan. It was a change in practice versus change in methodology.
Or would the other larger districts be more likely to want to join us in leaving?
I don't know the answer. Yeah, I don't know the
I
answer
think
to
the
that.
vote count of the recent vote would be more likely to tell us who might be interested versus not interested. You might, someone else going
I think so. The vote count, some of our feeders voted,
With us.
Right.
with us.
And for context, the impact to our budget, while it's a much larger dollar amount, we have the ability to absorb that more than a small district where $100,000 or $200,000 swing could mean the difference of a negative certification.
And that percentage, we were not the most impacted.
No.
There are other districts that were more negatively.
So, and this is where it really matters. Equity and non-discrimination and all of that in the way that that districts are enrolling students. So,
Okay. I'm sorry.
no,
Well, I had a question about a comment you made earlier.
Right.
You said that the
mhm,
federal has never met their obligation.
yes.
But how do we make them? What do we need to do to ensure that they do? And
There's,
is it,
right.
I mean, from a percentage, does it even make a difference or?
It would if they actually did something about it. And there was some momentum for that a couple of years ago. In fact, we had, as a district, there was some talk about potentially suing for that. And when I reached out to some organizations who do advocacy, so specifically because I knew the director of Small School Districts Association and knew they were doing a lot of work around it. And so, I had reached out and they said, hey, we're actually talking to some legislators. And so please hold off on filing, if there's a group of you that are wanting to file, we'd like to get some perspective from a medium-sized district like we are, because they were really focused with smalls. And so we provided some input and feedback, and they thought they were going to have some traction. And then, we know that there were all kinds of issues with actually passing a budget and, all of these continued short-term things at the federal level that it really never went anywhere. And so we never picked that conversation up. I don't think that it would be very successful, but it would certainly, bring more attention. Right now, there are so many things, though, I don't know that it would just get lost in the noise.
So they're almost purposely withholding and like, what do you guys want to do with that? Why would they not?
So when IDEA was created, it was set with a aspirational commitment for funding that has never been met. So, I'm sure just like happens with us, there are all these things that we want to do and you can only spend it all once. And, when you think of an accounting class and, there's where do you put your resources? And it's called, the guns or butter question. And so, yes, a large percentage of, okay, are we funding security or are we funding social programs?
Well, so we have futures been driving on state mandates that are being funded, but my understanding is that under the state constitution, the federal government doesn't fund the mandate, still expects us to follow it, whereas if the state level is actually going for us to not.
Yeah.
What would the next steps be for us to know with analysis whether or not pursuing our own self-learning makes sense or not?
So what we'd want to do would be to contract with somebody to do that study for us on the revenue and expenditure side. From my perspective, I think it should be looked at from both sides of the equation.
So contract with somebody who can go or you need someone?
No, so for instance, so we could extend the contract with Dr. Gillespie to cover something like that. Other entities do it as well, such as the services. There's, there are a multitude of organizations that do that type of study. The one that did the last one for SCO was the same that did the consolidation study. So that was Christy White. So there are a number of, we could do an RFP if you would, if the board wants to explore that. RFP, request for proposals. I'm sorry. That's so when you contract for professional services, there's no requirement that we go out and get bids or anything like that. Typically call around and at least get an idea of, okay, who's reasonably priced or not. But there's no legal requirement to do so. You can contract for professional services without. So that's the question.
Deadline, yeah. Is that even possible?
Is that
what are we talking about?
I wouldn't connect the two because sending a notice sometimes doesn't require.
Exactly.
It's just a notice of
Leave the
intent.
option open.
More about, I prefer, if you could just, we have 10 years of history working towards something. And we obviously running with people involved in how these numbers are actually being implemented. Is this worth handing down, is worth exploring, or is there something obvious that we have to?
My take on it, I can't say I'm even cautiously optimistic, but I think it's worth exploring because I don't think there's any cost to putting a notice in. Aside from that, I think it's good that Santa Rosa asserts itself with respect to itself, but just generally speaking, I think that's a good thing. So if I would recommend, I'd say it's, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn. It's worth putting in a notice this year and start to have conversations with some of our neighboring districts, and then potentially contracting with somebody. I mean, you're correct. We are very close to the number, and so forth. So that's my thought on it.
We're here to have discussions and make recommendations. Maybe give feedback, but you don't need to go to the board. How do you see that? Is it something that So we've been raising a month or two here for the noble recommendation. Is it something you want just to switch the board after you have a problem on
Um. Sorry, I wasn't thinking on that, but jumping to that one yet. I'm starting thinking, okay, I want to talk about, the work that John and Joel did.
Well, I want to talk about
The master schedule, or master agreements. Yeah, I think definitely.
Okay, so just a couple points. So
Sorry.
when I talked before, I was speaking to the transparency thing, and that was, I wanted to emphasize something because we're changing our procedure with respect to that. So the SELPA has a master contract with a number of non-public agencies and non-public schools in the county, and they engage in a rate setting process each year. In fact, the meetings were last Friday. I'm not sure typically districts have scrutinized it very closely. I'll say that I'm not an expert in it for sure, but a couple points too. So if we are if the district is contracting with somebody under the master contract, it technically doesn't have to go to the board, which we've decided is problematic because it's not particularly transparent. So we're coming up with a process to, at least on a notification or something in that nature, to bring that to the board. For example, the Inspire contract, which I brought to the board because they weren't under the master contract, was in the neighborhood of $6.4 million, something like that. That's our non-public agency. It's very large. So in any event, those are going to be brought to the board at least on a notification about those expenditures, because under the SELPA master contract, things can easily fly under the radar. All right, second point. With respect to rate setting, so Joel Dantes and my coordinator Kathy, I was couldn't be at the board meeting, so in any event, we're at the rate setting meeting last week, and from what I've heard,
Yeah. Oh no, I was saying, yeah, 2 weeks. Yeah.
sorry,
I know they're all. I was just going. It just took me. I'm like, wait.
no, like a week and a half, whenever it was. My time sense is gone. So as I understand it, Joel was pushing back pretty hard against rate increases. Side point to that, we are large enough to where we can potentially negotiate individually with some of our larger providers. For example, Inspire will by far the biggest customer. So I think our intent going forward is, regardless of the rate set at the self-master contract, is to negotiate individually, essentially volume is what we're talking about with some of our non-public agencies. Possibly non-public schools. We do have a NOVA, which we have 42 something of that nature placement for the NOVA at $60,000-$70,000 a piece. So that's our intent going forward, to hopefully rein in those costs and increases a bit. We're not obligated to hold the master contract. No, you can contract individually. It's I almost want to say it's like a preferred status rate or something like that in the local area. I don't even know how to describe it. People tend to typically go along with it, but a district can absolutely contract individually. Sometimes districts will pay more than what the rates are set at, but we're not bound by it whatsoever.
And so for context, and I believe this was the first time that we were invited to participate in that rate setting.
I think we've been there before, but we have never had somebody from fiscal there, which I think is the difference.
And this is something that I very much appreciate, that there were, from my understanding, there were these agencies that were requesting increases, some of them like a 10% increase, who received a 10% increase the year before. And so Joel's argument was, why would we approve that when that's actually everything that we give in one of those is money that we don't have available to recruit our own staff? Yeah. That's the pushback that we get, is that, well, you're paying these non-public agencies so much. Well, yeah, that's right. We are, and we shouldn't be. Those should be dollars that we should be redirecting to be able to, to try to get our own staff in here. But for the smaller districts, for them, they don't have that leverage that we do. And so they're kind of at the mercy of that master agreement and those increases. So I think they just have, I don't believe that they have had those conversations in that setting about what it really means to agree to the increases at the rates that they have.
And so we came out of that saying that we're not gonna be agreeing to the rates and accept to negotiate with us, or what do we say?
Well, it doesn't preclude us from using the master agreement, because we are a SELPA. I mean, because we are a member of the SELPA. However, we aren't required to. And so for us, our conversation was, unless there is some really good reason, and there's no reason we would not recommend, or just implement a master agreement. We would prefer to spend the time and effort and resources to negotiate our own separate rates and agreements. So those would come to the board rather than you seeing a master. They'll be few and far between that you would see a notification of a master agreement based on what happened last week. Like 2 weeks ago.
Kind of savings we're thinking about doing. This is the savings, if we use outside, vendors, it's not the difference between the outside vendors versus internal hiring. So it's really about what it costs if you can't internal hiring.
Yes, exactly.
And so, I mean, I know we're not gonna be able to do all of the special returns that you get in the contract.
Right.
So we talk a lot about things we can bring in-house, what's the kind of scope of what you anticipate having to keep in vendor relationships.
By far the biggest one with respect to vendors is paraeducators, classroom aides, one-to-ones, et cetera, which we salary-wise have not been able to compete, as I understand it. So my hope at this point, particularly with negotiating somewhat lower rates, we'll be able to hire some more, and also given current layoffs and so forth, perhaps we'll be able to hire some more. Paraeducators, for better or worse, have been at the bottom. I think the very bottom.
Very low on the
Or
scale.
very low. And we have not, again, as Lisa said, by approving rate increases, we're essentially, it's self-defeating for sure. It's hard for me to figure out exactly how much we're going to save in contracts, but I think we'll be able to negotiate somewhat better rates. Oh, I'm sorry. Sure. And there's so many words for it. So paraeducator is for those who are in a bargaining unit, it would be classified staff. And these are individuals who have some training, tend not to have a certification unless they're a super specialty. And for example, in our extensive support need classes, we might have 3 paraeducators in there working with the teacher, taking care of the needs of the students. Some more specialized ones could involve things like light medical, toileting, G-tube feeding, and so forth. But for the most part, they are classroom instructional aides that are working 1-to-1, 1-to-3, etc., with extremely high need students. In addition to that, we don't have that many, but we also have 1-to-1 aides, which are, or sometimes called inclusion aides, which are assigned to a student with an IEP and will accompany them typically to general education classes. Sometimes the student has a medical need. Sometimes that's a result of something close to litigation. It depends on the circumstance. That's an area we'd like to reduce the number of 1-to-ones in general, because it's super inefficient use of money.
And from a programmatic standpoint, it doesn't often you have 1-to-1 aides because it's comfortable and they know the students versus how are they developing independence.
100%.
And so it's not necessarily in the student's best interest to have a 1-to-1.
Questions? discussion on this sometime.
We can definitely bring back more special education, fiscal impact information.
So we have a strong intent to probably what we follow up on, study.
Yeah.
Once it's able to be.
Yeah.
So with that aspect, the other thing I'm hearing is you have the ability or the district, the board follow up on this question to pursue and notice and study and forming a new self. And then I think lastly, the revisions between the immediate aftermath and the new ones of this 1.3.6. Follow up when we start to see more of that forecast and so it'll go up or down again here in the near future. So we still have the 3 follow-ups. Anything else? All right, we're right on time. Again, we'll have one member of the public. I will do this with a huge crowd, but anything else, anything else to say on this before we start the next item?
Yeah, very quickly, so IDEA has never in its history, since President Ford created it, been fully funded.
Yep.
It's funded at about 13% right now, but fully funded would still be 40%. Right. So there's never been an intent to make it 100%. There was a bill introduced in the 118th Congress that was really highly backed and pushed by NEA that really didn't go anywhere. And basically right now we're worried about keeping any title money, right, rather than increasing IDEA. And also in terms of the paraeducators, one thing, it's not financial in any way, but one thing that does happen in our classrooms is when we have paraeducators that work for the agency versus paraeducators that work for us, we have 2 people in the same room doing the same job and earning different amounts of money.
Absolutely.
It definitely causes issues in the classroom. It also causes issues with the classroom teacher because the paraeducators that don't work for us have a tendency to not listen to our teachers. So those are just things that I'm sure you've got a lot more.
I'm sure both of those
Those
points.
are the things that have risen to the top in my conversations with
100%
special
agree.
educators. Yeah. So it's really, it would do more than help us financially to
Absolutely.
get more in-house
100%.
paraeducators and fewer agency.
In many ways.
In many ways, yeah.
It's what's best for kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's all. Thank you. Probably under 3 minutes.
I have to stop the meeting to go to. Okay.
Thank you.
Former, I don't know.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you.
Next up is receive discussion on Senate Bill 98. I got this correctly, so Senate Bill 98 from last year's session. And implementation of it, not a currently pending.
Correct, and I can, I'm doing some of it.
So there was a supporting link on the agenda to do a legislation, but we're bringing this forward to talk about here because there's a study bill, which basically the legislature wanted to study what it means to go from average daily attendance to enrollment-based funding for districts. And we said I've been invited to be involved in some of that, and we wanted to take advantage of having one of the experts in tap for it to give us some insights into where that is going and what we can do.
And also her and I will be at Sacramento, March 16th and 17th, pounding the pavement. And this is one of the things we're going to be pushing for.
Yeah. So through our affiliation with CASBO, which is the California Association of School Business Officials, they have opportunities to get involved, and I volunteered for advocacies to do some advocacy, and specifically they selected me as a representative with some others to speak to the legislative analyst office about the impacts or potential, ups and downs of, what what are our struggles, and, the LAO is essentially going to be looking at this and evaluating and then making a recommendation on what those impacts will be. One of the biggest concerns with switching to an enrollment versus an ADA funding model is that there's still not a larger pie. It's just a redistribution of the same pie. And with so many districts struggling for that percentage of ADA, unless there's, Prop 98 is supposed to guarantee a minimum funding level for us for every dollar that comes into the state. And it is looking like it is going back to being the ceiling, the floor and the ceiling. So it's okay, here's what it is, and that's it. There have been times where there's been a larger appropriation, but they keep trying to finagle more and more items into Prop 98, which again means that we don't have a larger pie. It's just a different way to divide that same pie. So that is one of the things that I think is going to come out of this study, and the likelihood that it will address getting us more funding overall as education. I don't know how successful that would be. There's definitely been a push for that, but with our current economy and the federal landscape, I don't know that state-wise there will be much opportunity to increase the size of the pie.
Can you explain, you just talked about the process and how we don't know whether we have the money to spend the money that we were spending until after it's over. So can you start with how this would be?
Right, it would help in that, as far as for a predictability, in that right now we will project our enrollment, just say it's 10,000. And we end up with, say, 9,000 who actually show up. And then out of those 9,000, they're absent 20% of the time. So our funding is based on that lower amount, the 80% of the 9,000. Versus if it were based on enrollment, it would be that, okay, yes, we had our projected enrollment of 10,000, and then we came in with only 9,000, we'd be funded on 9,000. And so for the staffing, because we have to staff as if every student is here every day. And so it is much more predictable for that, in that aspect.
So the one thing I think else would be like, if we receive an average of $10,000 per student, we might receive $9,000 per student, but we know that we're receiving $9,000.
Exactly.
What do you think the hour is, and what questions we can ask?
They have not reached out yet, so I don't have the timeline. My notification was LAO will be reaching out to you shortly. And so check in. In fact, I'd go and go, okay, I'm really far behind on some things. Nope, they haven't reached out yet. Doing search just to make sure. So I haven't yet. I don't know exactly what questions they'll ask. I would venture to guess that it's about the difficulty in budgeting and staffing based on ADA. And the other thing that I think something that will be a concern for them is that the feeling is that by changing from ADA based to enrollment based, we won't have, as a district, we won't have an incentive to try to continue attendance efforts and getting kids to school. I think that has been the argument against it over the years, that, well, then there's no incentive for you to make sure that kids get to school.
Make good schools if they want to go to school.
Exactly. And that, it's important that they're here so they can learn. Then we can focus on that as being the reason that they need to be here, not just because there's a fiscal impact.
Well, in general, maybe because you guys go to these conferences, are there many districts who feel that the AD model is successful for them? And then is there anyone?
No, not a single district.
So Yeah.
Not a single district. Every district I've worked with has been ADA and the struggle is the same in every district.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There will be winners and losers if it switches, if the pie is not larger. And so that's, that's probably part of, I'm sure that's gonna be one of the things that they study is that.
Rough understanding of how much staff time and money are spent on
ADA?
ADA versus that would be out of funds that could be spent in the classroom.
Oh,
General funds are going towards.
off the top of my head, no, but I mean,
I hadn't thought of
yeah.
it that way. I mean, I don't know how you even quantify that.
right, well, I mean, there are the
Yeah.
easy ones, like, okay, staffing related
Right.
to reporting ADA, but
Right.
they report more than just the ADA,
ADA,
so it's a
exactly.
percentage of it. There's, yeah. And regardless, there still wouldn't be a lack of need to report attendance.
Right.
So I don't know, actually.
A little more on the other side of moving from a qualitative experience with students to encouraging them to be present for benefit. Sometimes it feels like during the awareness month or whatever it is, like it's more of a
Money driven,
guilt
yeah.
trip to make
Yeah.
sure the students showing up or making
Yeah.
life events, so there'll be other reasons that are actually positive for them not to, but it's with that parents or that community, or not those students are always in the way.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to think of those types of activities where it would be more about students' needs and less about us needing money.
Exactly, yeah, and it changes the conversation from being punitive, to, incentivizing being here because there are good things that happen when you're here. So,
Questions? We've talked a lot about ADA and then that's it, we talked about. Not even quite 3 months. We've been doing this, which feels like a year. We're talking a lot about the ADA challenge,
Right.
high predictability, so it's really important to get on early. Any other questions about this?
Yeah, essentially this study takes place over this year. The report's due by January 1st of 26. Yeah, and then whatever happens from there.
Is there anywhere to see what districts are getting how much money based on the ADA? I don't know what a plan that is.
So yes, there's all kinds. So there's
I'm curious of like who is benefiting and who is.
that would have to do probably more with percentage of ADA. So if you have a high ADA percentage district where maybe they're averaging 95 or 96% versus we're hovering around 92%, which is still way better than it was right after COVID. We would essentially probably see an increase versus a district that's maybe at that 96 or 97, let's see a decrease. Because their percentage of the pie, depending on what their enrollment shift is, could adjust. So that's part of that question. And that's just a complete
Yes, I mean, I'm just wondering about things like, and does it tend to be like lower SES districts that have lower ADA? Are there trends like that?
So, that probably, but I can't tell you for sure. That would be an assumption, that could be incorrect. But one of the things, so typically schools that have independent study tends to have a higher ADA than in person. So higher percentage of attendance because it's based on actual work completion and time value and all of that good stuff. So there are things that, we can do to help that, such as if we move forward with, the work that's happening with expanding, in preparation to expand, independent study and virtual academy. Things of that nature.
I didn't think I was going to this one early.
And we'll adjourn on 5:20 p.m. Okay.
Thank you.